for Change and Jack the Tommy Broughan, who may be sharing.
I don't know. Gurmagot. No.
Okay.
I think there's already been a time in history when the members of one Parliament, we watched the actions of another Parliament and the Assembly, of course the House of Commons, and they're voting right now with, I think, profound frustration and sadness. Although all communities, of course, in the islands of Britain and Ireland, including business, farmers and civic society leaders, are pleading for some degree of certainty regarding the Brexit decision by the British people in 2016, the tortuous manoeuvres at Westminster and between the UK and the EU, they just simply seem to go on and on, Lascan. Of course, even the Theresa May deal only extends to December 2020, and we hear with dismay that major trade deals, of course, such as that between the possibly between the EU and the UK, it might take up to 7 years. So throughout the 2020s, this ordeal might continue. Of course, when we read the documents agreed by President Juncker and Theresa May yesterday, it seemed that at last a formula had been devised to permit the withdrawal agreement to be approved. The instrument relating to the withdrawal agreement, of course, acknowledged that the parties to the agreement don't wish the backstop to become applicable and that both were committed to a subsequent agreement to ensure that there would never be a hard border in Ireland and that both parties would, and I quote, use their best endeavours, end quote, to conclude by December 31st, 2020 an agreement to supersede the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, in whole or in part. And of course, Section 12 of the instrument referred to the use of the dispute mechanism enshrined in Articles 167 to 181 of the withdrawal agreement. The joint statement, of course, of the EU and the UK seemed also to amplify the reassurance given to the UK on the backstop, and this is also reflected, of course, in the declaration by the UK government on the Northern Ireland protocol and backstop. So it was therefore, I think, mind-boggling, Lascan, that Prime Minister May's efforts in this regard were totally undermined and fatally undermined by her own Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox MP, and who concluded, of course, that the instrument and other documents, while they reduced the risk of the UK being detained indefinitely without further agreement in the backstop, his final and unnecessary paragraph that the UK couldn't legally exit the backstop, and I quote, say, by agreement with Ireland and the EU, seems to have given another excuse to hardline Brexiteers to prolong the UK withdrawal agony. And it's no wonder, of course, people ask why a Prime Minister wouldn't have run an agreement past her Attorney General in the first place, but they've also lamented, of course, that Mrs May couldn't have chosen a reliable Attorney General, as, of course, Mr Blair did in relation to the Iraq war when he launched his disastrous campaign in Iraq. But the publication of the UK's proposed initial tariff regime today under a no-deal Brexit, of course, it has crystallised the profound anxieties of our farming and business community. The threat of tariffs on beef of 53% of the EU external tariff, poultry, I think, of 60% and 100% on sheep meat, they together form a frightening prospect for our indigenous exporting industry. And it's no reassurance, of course, to us that these tariffs wouldn't apply, of course, to our exports to Northern Ireland. It does raise the issue, of course, which Deputy Boyd Barrett and others have mentioned, of what happens in a situation where the European Union would seem to expect us to erect a hard border on non-European or in UK goods coming into this country against our will, and how we would react to that. And of course, the UK says it intends to cut tariffs to zero on 87% of imports to the UK, but it acknowledges that imports of beef and cheddar cheese, for example, will be very severely hit. So I think obviously this publication today is intended not just to put pressure on recalcitrant Brexiteers of the European Research Group, but also on the Taoiseach Varadkar and the Irish Government. But the so-called temporary tariff regime document and so-called strictly temporary unilateral approach, they're clearly a direct threat to end the backstop for the British Government's wish to end the backstop, which the Dáil and the Irish Government, of course, must relentlessly resist. So I strongly support the comments of other speakers supporting whatever budgetary steps are necessary to protect our economy and all sectors of our society. I agree with the ICTU and the Sinn Féin proposal for a Brexit redress fund, and I oppose the rainy day fund, of course, like other deputies, but at this time in our country's development, given our severe problems, Lascan, in health and housing. But now that the rainy day fund is coming into existence, that funding and indeed other national savings managed by May and the various funds it looks after, it should be allocated to protect against a severe and indeed existential threat of a no-deal Brexit and the many problems which may arise with even a much softer Brexit. As my colleague Deputy Boyd Barrett said earlier this afternoon, we listened to the Deputy Director General of the EU Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs, Mr. Carlos Martinez Monge, and his team, responding to our questions in relation to the European semester. And, of course, one of the questions I asked him was why, in fact, the European Union wasn't taking much more seriously the kind of scenarios which would arise for Ireland in budgetary and fiscal terms if, in fact, we have a hard Brexit or, indeed, any kind of a disorderly Brexit. And the fact that our 7% stellar growth in 2018, it could simply evaporate within a year or two. And, of course, the Department of Finance is issuing more and more dismal forecasts of what may be going to happen to us. Our own PBO, as you know, our Parliamentary Budget Office, last can, in their paper number 8 of 2019, recently on the impact of a disorderly or no-deal Brexit, they included estimates of cuts in GDP for 2019 by the Central Bank, a cut of 3%. The Department of Finance's forecast was 1.5% cut, and ESRI's suggestion was 1.4% cut, with longer-term estimates of cuts to growth by 6% from the Central Bank, 4.5% from the Department of Finance, and 3.8% by 2027 by ESRI, and with a loss of 55,000 jobs. So, and in fact, these figures, of course, may be too sanguine in relation to a hard Brexit. So let's hope tonight that if this vote, when this vote is announced, that the no-deal resolution has been taken off the table, and of course it will also depend on the UK Government seeking an extension to Article 50 to enable the final passage of a withdrawal agreement. I believe, of course, the formula for implementing the Brexit referendum decision by the British people, which has been developed by Keir Starmer MP and Jeremy Corbyn MP, of a customs union with EU market access for the UK and clear alignment, and in particular protection of workers' rights in the UK, would seem to be the fairest basis for a future close relationship between Britain and the EU 27, including our country. Such a resolution, of course, as a colleague has said, will depend on the Labour Party winning a general election, which hopefully will put an end to the current shambles, confusion and stasis of the House of Commons. In a related context, of course, last week, Minister, I thought that President Macron's so-called letter to the citizens of Europe was very unhelpful. The federalist tone of that letter and the French President's earlier speech at the Sorbonne only seems to reiterate many of the reasons why such a large segment of British public opinion voted for Brexit in the first place in 2016. President Macron's so-called roadmap for the EU doesn't, of course, just include some possible useful initiatives like combating cyber threats to democracies, an EU minimum wage and an EU climate bank, but it also included a new treaty of defence and security, which incidentally will include the UK, with a European Security Council and what he calls and I quote, a true European army. Macron's ministers admit that his federalist proposals scares people, but the whole tone of this address is one of even greater convergence and integration. But as our colleague Senator Michael McDowell, I think, argued cogently in last week's Sunday Business Post, nobody in Ireland voted from 1973 onwards for a United States of Europe. So rather than allowing the European Union, and indeed all of Europe, because a lot of Europe is still outside the European Union, to develop as a free and flexible confederation of the European peoples, at the worst possible time, President Macron comes out with these statements, with the European future of Britain completely in the balance. In reality, of course, Macron, Merkel and all the other EU leaders should be doing everything possible to keep the UK in the EU orbit and desist from threats and deliberately confusing roundabout negotiations, which also represent such a serious threat to all the people of Ireland. For example, I mean, why is there a withdrawal and a future arrangement negotiations? Why wasn't there one single divorce negotiations? I mean, that plan for a double negotiation, of course, came from the European Union. So let's hope, anyway, that the proposed Europe 2.0 or Norway Plus model is the relationship Britain will maintain with the European Union if and when Brexit does happen. But whatever happens, Minister, the Irish Government can't concede on any element of a hard border during any backstop period or in any future long-term relationship.